The lights that once worshipped him now expose every scar. It happened in Malibu. A quiet afternoon turned into one of the most shocking moments in entertainment history. Simon Cowell, the man who built empires from talent shows and shaped modern television itself, was hurled off a high-powered electric bike in his own courtyard. The impact was brutal. His spine snapped in multiple places. In a heartbeat, the world's most feared and admired TV mogul, the man whose single raised eyebrow could end careers, was left motionless on the ground, paralyzed by pain and disbelief. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital. Surgeons worked for 6 relentless hours, inserting a steel rod along his shattered back. When he finally awoke, the man who once ruled primetime television couldn't even lift a glass of water. News spread like wildfire. The industry trembled. Could Simon Cowell, the man who defined modern fame, survive this? For 2 decades, he had been the embodiment of control, perfection, dominance. Yet now he faced the one enemy that cared nothing for power: mortality. The irony was staggering. A man who spent his life judging others now faced the harshest judgment of all: whether he would ever walk again. Insiders leaked details: unbearable pain, sleepless nights, the terror of permanent paralysis. Fans worldwide flooded social media, shocked that their icon of toughness could fall so hard so suddenly. And yet, from that hospital bed, something extraordinary began. The ruthless critic who built legends from other people's dreams was forced to rebuild his own life from the ruins of his body. That crash was more than an accident. It was the moment Simon Cowell's empire of control collapsed, revealing the fragile, haunted man beneath the legend. The crash left Simon Cowell at war with his own body. Every breath was a reminder that survival came with agony. 6 screws and a steel rod held his spine together, yet his will was the only thing keeping him alive. Doctors warned him to stay still for months, but Simon had never known stillness. The man who once commanded global stages now struggled to sit upright. Every inch of progress, a twitch of the foot, a slow breath, was a private battle between pain and defiance. Those close to him say he cried in silence at night, not out of weakness, but from the sheer terror of losing everything that had defined him. For years, control had been his armor. Now, even lifting a spoon required help. He had built a life measured by applause, but now he was learning to measure life by motion, by the fragile miracle of standing again. As the entertainment world speculated about his future, Simon withdrew. He refused public pity, canceling appearances, staying hidden in his Malibu home. The tabloids called it a fall from grace. They were wrong. It was a rebirth, violent, painful, but real. For the first time, Simon Cowell was stripped of image and power. He wasn't the TV tyrant anymore. He was just a man staring at the ceiling, asking whether he had spent his life chasing everything but what mattered most. He once said, "I've always been afraid of losing control." Now that control was gone, he realized how empty it had made him. In the quiet months of recovery, he began to see what fame had blinded him to: the fragility of time, the weight of every missed moment. His 6-year-old son Eric would run into the room, his laughter echoing off the walls, reminding Simon what no empire could buy: presence. Those afternoons became his therapy. He learned to walk again, not for cameras, but for his son. The same fire that built idols was now dedicated to fatherhood. Each painful step was a vow that he would never let ambition steal those moments again. By the end of the year, Simon returned to the world, not with arrogance, but with humility etched across his face. He thanked fans, admitted fear, and spoke openly about mortality. "You don't realize how fragile you are until everything stops," he said. It wasn't a quote for headlines, it was a confession. The man who had once terrified contestants with brutal honesty had finally turned that honesty inward. The crash that almost ended Simon Cowell didn't destroy him. It dismantled the illusion and revealed something stronger: A man who had finally learned the value of being alive. When Simon Cowell finally returned to the world, it wasn't with the swagger of the untouchable mogul who once ruled primetime television. It was with the cautious, deliberate steps of a man who had seen death blink back at him. Cameras followed his every move, searching for weakness, but what they found instead was transformation. His face was thinner, his posture stiffer, his voice lower, no longer the sharp, commanding tone of a ruthless judge, but the grounded calm of someone who had wrestled with mortality and survived. The crash had carved humility into him. Gone was the man who measured success by ratings and contracts. In his place stood someone learning to measure life by mornings without pain and nights spent reading to his son. Friends say Simon began speaking in ways no one had heard before. He stopped discussing market shares and audience reach and started asking people about their families, about sleep, about happiness. For decades, he had been the man who made others tremble. Now he was the one seeking peace. The empire still ran, the global Got Talent formats, the endless auditions, but his presence had changed. On set, his famous glare softened. Contestants who once feared his critique now found encouragement. "I used to think my job was to find perfection," he admitted. "Now I just want to find authenticity." That single sentence became the new heartbeat of his career. Behind the scenes, the recovery was relentless. Physical therapy sessions lasted hours. Each step on the treadmill felt like walking on broken glass. Yet he refused to hide. In private interviews, he revealed the darkest truth, that during the early weeks after the accident, he had genuinely believed his career and maybe his life was over. "I lay there thinking, this is it. Everything I built, everything I worked for, ends here." But then he would hear Eric's small footsteps running into the room, his laugh cutting through the fear. "That sound kept me alive," Simon said quietly. It was not an exaggeration. It was the simple truth. The empire that once consumed him now existed only as a backdrop to fatherhood. Still, the road back to confidence was cruel. Paparazzi photos of him in a back brace splashed across tabloids. Online mockery followed. Headlines called him the broken judge. But the world underestimated Simon's defiance. Rather than retreat, he leaned into honesty. On camera, he addressed it head-on. "Yes, I was broken, but I'm still here." That moment, raw and unfiltered, marked the rebirth of his image. Viewers didn't just see a celebrity recovering. They saw resilience made human. For the first time, Simon Cowell wasn't playing a part. He was living one. In the months that followed, he spoke about the accident not as tragedy, but as revelation. He confessed that before the fall, he had been running on fumes. No sleep, endless work, feeding a machine that devoured his health and happiness. "I thought I was invincible," he said. "Now I know I'm not, and I'm grateful for that." That candor stunned fans who had only known him as arrogant and cold. It turned out that beneath the sharp tongue and polished suits was a man terrified of slowing down because slowing down meant facing himself. His transformation didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues described a calmer, almost spiritual Simon, someone who laughed more, listened longer, and walked with deliberate patience. He began mentoring young producers not about power, but about balance. "You can't build an empire if you destroy yourself in the process," he told one. The statement spread across social media, a quote that felt like prophecy from the man who had lived it. And yet, beneath the newfound calm, there remained the spark that had always defined him. He still demanded excellence, still recognized talent before anyone else. But the edge had softened. It was no longer cruelty. It was clarity. The accident had stripped him down to what truly mattered: his health, his family, and the legacy of compassion he wanted to leave behind. When he finally appeared again on America's Got Talent, the audience rose to its feet. It wasn't for his judgments or his power. It was for his survival. The applause thundered through the theater, not as worship, but as relief. Simon Cowell, the man who had once seemed untouchable, had proven something far more enduring, that even the strongest can break and still find the strength to stand again. That night, as lights flashed and cameras rolled, Simon smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and for the first time in decades, he looked not like the man controlling the spotlight, but like someone finally free from it. By 2022, Simon Cowell had learned to walk again, but life was not done testing him. Just as his strength returned, fate dealt him another blow. On a gray morning in London, while trying out a new e-bike, he crashed again, this time shattering his arm and bruising his face. Photos of him bandaged and dazed spread instantly across the internet. Headlines screamed, "Cowell cursed by bikes," and "TV's toughest man broken again." For someone who had survived the humiliation of failure, the sting of public mockery was nothing new, yet this time it cut deeper. He wasn't just fighting pain, he was fighting fear, fear that the next fall might end everything. The second accident became a mirror, forcing Simon to confront what he had refused to face for decades, his addiction to control, to risk, to proving he was indestructible. Lying in the hospital once more, he realized he wasn't Superman. He was a man in his 60s, mortal, vulnerable, and tired. The relentless drive that once made him untouchable had nearly destroyed him twice. "I kept pushing myself," he told a close friend later. "And for what? Ratings? Deals? It's insane." That confession marked the first time in his career he admitted exhaustion, not ambition, was now his biggest opponent. When he returned home, recovery became a ritual of humility. Each morning began with cautious stretches prescribed by his therapists. Gone were the high-octane gym sessions. Now he moved slowly, methodically, grateful for every pain-free motion. He traded late-night meetings for early dinners with his son, bike rides for long walks on the Malibu coast. Even the decor of his home shifted. Fewer awards on display, more photos of Eric. The boys' laughter filled the rooms once haunted by silence. "He's my reminder that I'm still alive," Simon told one interviewer quietly. But the world of fame never truly lets you rest. Cameras found him again, snapping shots of his healing face, his thinner frame, his tentative smile. Social media dissected his appearance. Some praised his resilience, others mocked his fragility. Yet through it all, Simon stayed silent. For a man once defined by words sharp enough to break hearts, his silence spoke louder than ever. He no longer needed to prove anything. The man who once demanded perfection now seemed at peace with imperfection. Privately, though, Simon was still reckoning with the fear of mortality. Nights were restless, haunted by flashbacks of both crashes, the spinning wheels, the sudden darkness, the sound of bones snapping. He began journaling for the first time, filling pages with gratitude and regret. Friends said he had become philosophical, even spiritual, a side few had ever seen. "He used to talk about power," one colleague said. "Now he talks about peace." His transformation resonated with fans who had followed him for decades. When he reappeared on Britain's Got Talent, the audience didn't see a fallen icon. They saw a survivor. Viewers flooded social media with messages of support, calling him human at last. His voice, still firm but gentler, carried a new warmth. He encouraged contestants instead of dismantling them. "I've learned the hard way," he told one nervous singer. "Sometimes you fall, and it's the fall that teaches you how to stand." That line went viral, shared millions of times, becoming an unintentional anthem for resilience. Behind the scenes, he quietly reorganized his empire. He delegated authority, took fewer meetings, and focused on mentoring young producers. "Don't chase applause," he advised. "Chase meaning." To his staff, it was as if their boss had been replaced by someone wiser, slower, but infinitely more human. By the end of 2022, Simon Cowell's scars had become symbols. They weren't just reminders of accidents, they were proof of endurance. He had faced pain, humiliation, and public ridicule, and somehow turned them into purpose. The once invincible mogul had been stripped down to flesh, bone, and resolve. And what emerged was something the world had never truly seen before. Not the judge, not the brand, but the man. In the quiet of his Malibu home, as the Pacific shimmered beyond the glass walls, Simon often stood watching the horizon with his son beside him. No cameras, no applause, just two figures, one small, one scarred, both alive. For the first time in his life, Simon Cowell wasn't planning, building, or judging. He was simply existing. And for a man who had spent decades chasing perfection, that peace was the greatest triumph of all. By 2023, Simon Cowell's life had slowed to a rhythm that once would have terrified him. The man who had thrived on deadlines, headlines, and the roar of live audiences was now content with mornings of silence and evenings of laughter echoing from his son's bedroom. But peace, for Simon, had never come easily. It had to be earned through pain. Every step still reminded him of the steel in his spine, every sleepless night a reminder that survival comes with scars. Yet, what shocked those closest to him was not his fragility, but how deeply he had changed. He no longer spoke about ratings or money. Instead, he talked about gratitude. He began calling old friends he hadn't spoken to in years, apologizing, reconnecting. "I don't want my legacy to be fear," he told one producer over dinner. "I want it to be kindness." That word, kindness, sounded foreign coming from the man once famous for brutal honesty. But now it defined him. His transformation wasn't a public relations strategy. It was raw, human evolution. Even his staff noticed the shift. Meetings once driven by precision and perfection now ended with laughter, sometimes even tears. The once icy boardroom had become a space where vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. Professionally, Simon's empire remained vast, yet his focus had turned inward. America's Got Talent and Britain's Got Talent continued to thrive, but he appeared on camera less frequently, choosing instead to mentor behind the scenes. Younger producers described him as a gentle general, still sharp, still demanding, but infinitely more patient. His critiques became lessons rather than verdicts. "Don't try to impress me," he told contestants. "Make me feel something." It was the essence of his rebirth, replacing fear with feeling. Outside the studios, his days were disciplined but quiet. He followed a strict health regimen designed to keep his spine and heart stable. Yoga stretches each morning, low-sodium meals, long walks on the Malibu cliffs. The man once addicted to excess now practiced moderation with monk-like devotion. Alcohol vanished from his life, replaced by herbal tea and early nights. He often spoke about earning every sunrise, a phrase that became almost spiritual in his vocabulary. But beneath the calm, his body carried the price of everything he had survived. The back pain never fully left. The fatigue was constant. His vision had weakened from years under studio lights and sleepless schedules. Close friends described moments when he would pause mid-conversation, squinting, trying to focus on faces that had begun to blur. He admitted privately that the thought of one day not being able to see his son clearly frightened him more than any accident ever could. Still, he smiled through it. "I've seen enough of the world," he said. "Now I just want to see him grow up." At home, luxury no longer dazzled him. The Beverly Hills mansion that once screamed success had transformed into a quiet sanctuary. Gone were the late-night parties and endless meetings. Instead, the living room floor was covered with Legos, and the kitchen filled with laughter. He and Eric built toy racetracks, watched cartoons, and spent hours by the ocean, collecting shells as if time itself had stopped waiting for them. For Simon, this simplicity was the greatest wealth of all. Financially, he remained one of the richest figures in entertainment with an estimated fortune exceeding $600 million. Yet money had lost its meaning. He drafted a will that shocked even his closest advisors. Eric would not inherit his empire. Instead, the vast majority of his wealth would go into foundations for children's health care, music scholarships, and creative education programs. "I don't want him to inherit money," Simon explained. "I want him to inherit values and the opportunity to build his own life." It was an extraordinary gesture from a man once synonymous with ego and dominance. By now, even his appearance told a story of surrender. The Botox, fillers, and cosmetic enhancements were gone. His face, marked by lines and softened by time, carried something rare for Simon Cowell: authenticity. He no longer hid behind youth or perfection. "I stopped chasing mirrors," he joked in an interview. "I'd rather chase memories." The public, once cruel about his vanity, now praised his honesty. What had once been mocked as weakness was now seen as courage. And yet the greatest surprise of all was how the same man who once terrified contestants now inspired them. They no longer saw a ruthless judge. They saw a survivor, a father, a man who had lost, fallen, and rebuilt himself in front of the world's cameras. "If Simon Cowell can come back from everything," one young singer said during auditions, "maybe we all can." That was his quiet victory. Not ratings, not money, not fame, but impact. Simon Cowell, once the cold face of judgment, had become the warm voice of resilience. His life had shifted from empire building to meaning making, from noise to silence, from applause to authenticity. The man who once demanded perfection now understood that the most beautiful thing a person can be is imperfect, but still standing. By early 2024, Simon Cowell's world seemed finally balanced. Quiet mornings, steady health, the comforting chaos of fatherhood. Yet peace, as he had learned too many times before, is fragile. In September, tragedy struck with a cruelty no one could have imagined. Liam Payne, the boy Simon had discovered at 16, the voice that helped ignite the global phenomenon of One Direction, was gone. The news broke like a thunderclap across social media. A fatal fall from a hotel balcony in Buenos Aires. Fans refused to believe it. Tabloids scrambled for details. But for Simon, it was personal. Liam wasn't just a star on a contract. He was family. When the call came, Simon was at home in Malibu. Witnesses recall him going silent, the phone slipping from his hand. "It felt like losing a son," he later said. The irony was unbearable. He had built an empire on giving dreams life, yet now one of his brightest lights had been extinguished. He canceled all meetings, switched off his phone, and disappeared from public view. The man who had faced ridicule, bankruptcy, and near death now faced something far worse: the loss of someone he had helped bring into the world of fame, a world that had both made and broken them. For weeks, Simon avoided the press. Behind closed doors, he grieved in private, surrounded only by his closest friends and his son Eric. The boy, now 10, sensed something heavy in the air. "He didn't talk much," one friend revealed. "He just sat with Eric, holding him a little tighter every night." Those quiet moments became his way of coping, each bedtime story, each hug a desperate act of holding on to life after being reminded how easily it can vanish. Liam's death forced Simon to confront the darker truth about the world he had created. For decades, he had manufactured fame, shaping stars with machine-like precision. But the industry's glare, he now admitted, was merciless. "We build them up so high," he confided to a colleague, "and then watch them fall when they can't breathe up there." It was the most painful acknowledgement of his career, that success could destroy just as easily as it could save. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the Got Talent family, where even the toughest producers broke down in silence during filming. When Simon finally spoke publicly, his words were stripped of the usual media polish. "Liam was one of the kindest, most genuine souls I've ever met," he said, voice trembling. "This industry can give you everything, and take everything away. I hope we all remember to take care of each other." It was more than a statement. It was an admission from a man who had spent years defining others' worth, now humbled by loss beyond comprehension. After the funeral, Simon retreated to his Malibu home for nearly 2 months. He spent hours replaying old audition tapes of One Direction, pausing on Liam's first shy smile, the uncertain but hopeful energy of that 16-year-old boy. Those images broke him open. They weren't just memories of a star's beginning. They were reminders of how fleeting innocence truly is. Friends say he wept openly, whispering, "I should have protected them better." That guilt turned into resolve. By year's end, Simon announced a new philanthropic initiative in Liam's honor, a foundation dedicated to mental health support for young artists in the entertainment industry. "Fame is not freedom," he said at the launch event, his voice steady but heavy. "If we don't teach them how to survive it, we're failing them." The statement resonated globally. For once, Simon Cowell wasn't creating stars. He was trying to save them. In private, though, the grief lingered. He spoke less, smiled less, and spent more time with Eric, often canceling work to be home. The man who once flew between continents in a single week now found solace in the simple act of making breakfast with his son. "Every laugh, every small moment, I hold on to them now," he told an interviewer later, "because I know how quickly they can disappear." By the end of 2024, Simon had emerged from the tragedy changed yet again. His empire continued to thrive, but his heart no longer beat for business. It beat for connection, for meaning, for redemption. The death of Liam Payne had left a scar that would never fully heal, but it had also given him clarity. The boy he lost reminded him of the boy he once was, restless, ambitious, desperate to be seen. And now, standing at 65, Simon Cowell finally understood the one truth that all his power, fame, and fortune could never teach him. That in the end, it isn't the applause that defines a life. It's the love that remains when the music stops. When 2025 arrived, Simon Cowell stood at the crossroads of legacy and mortality. At 65, the man once feared for his cutting words had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, calm, reflective, profoundly human. Years of surviving scandal, loss, and physical pain had burned away everything superficial, leaving behind only what was essential: gratitude, fatherhood, and the quiet pursuit of peace. Yet even now, as the world continued to call him a legend, Simon viewed himself differently, not as a giant who conquered television, but as a survivor learning to live again. Each morning began the same way. Before the sun crept over the Malibu horizon, Simon would stretch beside the large glass windows of his oceanfront home, moving carefully to protect the spine that still ached from old wounds. The gentle sound of waves replaced the roar of studio crowds. A trainer monitored every motion, ensuring he didn't push too far. What once would have felt like weakness now felt like wisdom. "Slow," he often muttered, smiling at himself. "We go slow now." Breakfast followed, smoothies, fruit, vitamins, fuel for a man who no longer measured his worth by the speed of his success. His relationship with Eric had deepened into something sacred. The boy was now his shadow, a daily reminder of what truly mattered. They rode along the beach, built Lego empires, watched sunsets together. Sometimes Simon would stop mid-conversation, simply watching his son laugh as if memorizing every second. To those who knew him best, this was the real transformation, the ruthless mogul replaced by a gentle father whose entire world fit in the space of his child's smile. "He saved me," Simon admitted in an interview. Every bad thing I went through led me to the right place, the moment I became his dad. Professionally, his empire still pulsed with life. Got Talent. Continued to air in dozens of countries, a global brand worth hundreds of millions. But Simon no longer chased expansion. He attended only the episodes that mattered, leaving much of the production to younger protégés. "They have energy," he'd say with a grin. "I have experience, and a bad back." His humor, once sharp and biting, had softened into something warmer. Contestants no longer feared his critiques. They sought his approval like advice from an elder statesman. When he smiled now, it carried the weight of survival, not superiority. Behind that smile, however, his body still reminded him of everything it had endured. The pain in his lower spine flared without warning. His vision blurred after long hours under studio lights. Reading required glasses, and late-night scripts were replaced by audiobooks. He confessed privately that the idea of one day losing his sight terrified him, not because of fame, but because he might no longer see Eric's face clearly. That fear fueled his discipline. He followed every doctor's order, every dietary plan, even the bland meals that once would have driven him mad. Materially, he had everything. 3 mansions across London, Beverly Hills, and Malibu. A fleet of luxury cars, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, a Bugatti Veyron, now mostly gathering dust. A private jet that flew less than ever. "They're just things," he said. "Beautiful, expensive, meaningless things." His priorities had shifted toward legacy. In 2025, he finalized a monumental philanthropic plan that stunned the entertainment world. The majority of his fortune, estimated at more than $600 million, would go to foundations supporting children's hospitals, music education, and scholarships for underprivileged youth. Eric would inherit values, not wealth. "I want him to earn his own name," Simon explained. "Money gives comfort, but struggle gives character." Those close to him say that the old Simon, the fierce competitor, the perfectionist, still appears in flashes. When a contestant sings off-key, when a production delay tests his patience, the legendary Cowell glare resurfaces. But it no longer carries cruelty. It's tempered by empathy. "He still wants greatness," a longtime colleague said, "but now he wants people to be okay too." That duality, fire and forgiveness, defines him in this final act of his career. Evenings find him on the balcony overlooking the Pacific, a cup of tea in hand. Sometimes he hums quietly to himself, melodies from the artists he once discovered, echoes of a life spent chasing sound and success. He often reflects on the paradox of his existence. The man who made millions by judging others had found salvation in letting go of judgment altogether. "I've spent decades telling people what they were doing wrong," he mused recently. "Maybe now my job is to show that it's never too late to do something right." Simon Cowell's story, once defined by ambition and arrogance, has evolved into something deeper, an anthem of endurance. He no longer seeks perfection, he seeks peace. The cameras still roll, the world still watches, but the real drama now unfolds quietly, in the pauses between his words, in the way he reaches for his son's hand, in the acceptance that life's greatest victories are not won on stage, but in the heart. By the spring of 2025, Simon Cowell's life had become something no one, including himself, could have predicted. The once ruthless architect of global television had turned into a figure of serenity, living proof that even the hardest hearts can soften with time and pain. Yet his story did not fade quietly. Each new appearance drew the same fascination. How had he survived everything? He spent most of his days in Malibu, far from the noise of red carpets. His mansion, once buzzing with publicists and executives, now felt like a sanctuary. A space filled with the scent of the sea and the laughter of a child. He began waking before dawn, practicing slow breathing beside the open windows as the Pacific shimmered in early light. The steel rod in his spine still ached when the weather changed, and his legs often stiffened, but he refused to complain. To visitors, he would simply grin and say, "Pain reminds me I'm still here." That line became something of a mantra for him. Professionally, Simon now chose projects based not on profit, but on purpose. He funded charity concerts, underwrote music programs for children in poor neighborhoods, and visited hospitals without cameras to meet young patients who dreamed of singing on stage one day. The man who once built stars now devoted his life to building opportunities. "Fame fades," he told a group of students in London. "But kindness leaves an echo." The students gave him a standing ovation, not because of his fame, but because of his sincerity, a quality many believed he had once lacked. Behind that calm demeanor, however, lay a man still wrestling with time. Doctors continued to monitor his blood pressure and vision. Some nights, the throbbing in his back kept him awake, forcing him to walk through the halls until sunrise. On those sleepless nights, he would replay his past in his mind. The arrogant young producer, the empire builder, the fall, the scandals, the pain. "I was chasing the wrong applause," he once confessed to a journalist. "Now I just want to make sure the noise I leave behind is good noise." Eric, his son, had become his anchor. The boy's curiosity, his endless laughter, reminded Simon daily that the world was still beautiful. They spent weekends cooking simple meals, walking their dogs, or watching old movies. Sometimes Eric would ask about his father's TV shows, the lights, the fame, the endless crowds. Simon would smile and say, "They were exciting, but this is better." The boy didn't fully understand yet, but he would one day. Every decision Simon made now revolved around giving Eric a life, grounded not in luxury, but in meaning. The outside world still called him the most powerful man in television, though Simon himself laughed at the title. "Power?" he said in one interview. "Power is being able to sit at dinner with your kid and not check your phone." His newfound humility fascinated the media. For decades, they had painted him as the villain, the cold-hearted perfectionist who crushed dreams. Now, in his 60s, they found a man who talked about forgiveness, family, and time as his greatest teachers. Financially, Simon's empire remained enormous, more than $600 million in assets spread across 3 continents. But he had already planned how it would end. He signed documents ensuring that after his death, his wealth would flow into foundations supporting children's creativity and medical care. "I built this fortune from dreams," he explained. "It should go back to dreams." His attorneys called it the most generous entertainment legacy in modern British-American television history. When he appeared on the Britain's Got Talent anniversary special that spring, the reaction was overwhelming. Audiences rose not out of excitement, but out of respect. The man walking onto that stage was no longer the iron-faced judge they once feared. He was a survivor, a mentor, a father, a philanthropist. His voice trembled slightly as he addressed the crowd. "You've all seen me at my best and my worst, but through every fall I've learned this. Life doesn't reward perfection, it rewards persistence." The applause that followed was thunderous, but this time it didn't feed his ego. It healed him. Later that evening, as cameras faded and the lights dimmed, Simon stood alone backstage, listening to the faint echo of clapping fading into silence. He felt the weight of years, the triumphs, the pain, the countless stories born from his choices. And then he smiled. For the first time in his entire life, the silence felt full, not empty. Simon Cowell's journey had come full circle, from the invisible boy in a mailroom to the giant of global entertainment, from arrogance to empathy, from judgment to understanding. He had been broken and rebuilt, despised and redeemed. What remained was not the empire or the fame, but the humanity he had fought so long to reclaim. His story no longer belonged to television. It belonged to every person who had ever fallen and dared to rise again. By the summer of 2025, Simon Cowell was living proof that the human spirit could endure almost anything. Yet even with his empire stable, his health improving, and his family by his side, the echoes of everything he had survived continued to shape him. Fame had given him wealth beyond measure, but it had also stripped him bare, revealing the quiet truth that no amount of success could ever protect a man from pain. What astonished those closest to him was not that he had changed. It was how deeply he had chosen to. His mornings began with simplicity, a slow stretch to ease the pain in his back, a few careful steps along the marble floors of his Malibu home, and then the soft laughter of Eric as sunlight poured through the glass walls. That laughter was his favorite sound, the reminder that all the chaos, all the ambition, had finally led to peace. His diet was meticulously managed. No salt, no excess sugar, no late-night indulgence. He had traded champagne for green juice, parties for board games, and crowds for silence. And yet, that silence, once his greatest fear, had become his healing space. The outside world still watched him with fascination. Every rare public appearance was a headline. The man who once commanded the biggest shows on television now walked red carpets with quiet restraint, his suit simple, his smile sincere. When journalists asked about the past, he no longer deflected with sarcasm. "I've made mistakes," he said plainly, "a lot of them. But if pain doesn't teach you, nothing will." Those words carried weight because they came from someone who had learned them the hardest way possible. Professionally, Simon had shifted from being a gatekeeper to a guide. His production company now focused on developing new creators rather than new contestants. He personally mentored young producers, helping them navigate the same brutal industry that had once chewed him up. "You can't build something real by being cruel," he told one intern. "You build it by caring." That sentence, coming from the man once famous for televised cruelty, became almost mythic in entertainment circles. He no longer needed to dominate the stage. He wanted to empower the next generation to build their own. Still, his body carried its reminders. The scars along his back pulled tight on cold mornings, his vision blurred after long filming days. There were rumors of another small surgery, one meant to relieve pressure in his lower spine, but Simon never confirmed it. What mattered was that he kept moving, one careful step at a time. When asked about his fear of growing older, he replied with a laugh, "I don't fear getting old. I fear not learning while I still can." As his focus turned increasingly toward philanthropy, Simon's wealth began to flow into the causes closest to his heart. The foundation he had launched in Liam Payne's memory grew rapidly, funding mental health programs for young artists in over 20 countries. Parents of struggling teenagers wrote letters thanking him for using his platform to speak about pressure and loss. In interviews, Simon became emotional when discussing those messages. "If Liam's story can save even one kid," he said, "then something good came out of the pain." At home, his priorities remained the same. Family first. He often spoke of how his own father's silence had haunted him for decades. "He never told me he was proud," Simon said once. "I tell Eric every day." That promise became his redemption. The absence of warmth in his own childhood had taught him to build a different world for his son, a world filled with reassurance, love, and honesty. "You can't rewrite your past," he often reflected, "but you can rewrite what happens next." The media loved to speculate about his final act. Would he retire? Would he sell his empire? Simon only smiled at those questions. "Maybe," he'd say. "Maybe not. But if I do, it'll be to spend more time with my family and my foundations." Behind that calm answer lay a man who had finally learned to separate identity from industry. He no longer needed the spotlight. He had already lived several lives within it, and now he was content simply to live beyond it. At 65, Simon Cowell had become something few ever managed to be, both legend and lesson. His story was not a fairy tale, but a survival manual written in real time, one built on failure, resilience, and love. The world that once watched him for his judgment now watched him for his humanity. And in that transformation, Simon had achieved his truest victory, proving that the greatest power isn't in commanding millions of viewers, but in conquering oneself. When asked what legacy he hoped to leave behind, he paused for a long time before answering. "I don't want people to remember me for television," he said softly. "I want them to remember that I never stopped trying to be better." It was a simple sentence, but from Simon Cowell, it felt like the closing line to an extraordinary life. By the final months of 2025, Simon Cowell had quietly entered a new era, one that felt less like the epilogue to a career and more like the final movement of a long, unpredictable symphony. The man who had once measured his life in primetime ratings now measured it in heartbeats, in moments of laughter, in the sound of his son's footsteps echoing through the halls of their Malibu home. The world still called him a television titan, but Simon no longer lived like one. He was no longer chasing spotlights, he was chasing meaning. He spent his mornings outdoors, barefoot in the grass, letting the sea breeze wash over him. His back still ached, but the pain had become familiar, an old companion rather than an enemy. The rigid discipline of his recovery routine remained. Stretches, Pilates, long walks along the coast, a strict diet of clean meals and herbal tea. Yet beneath that structure lay freedom, the freedom to choose peace over pressure, reflection over performance. He would watch the sunrise with Eric by his side, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a playful argument about which cloud looked more like a dragon. "This," he would say softly, "is all I ever needed." Though his public appearances grew rare, they carried weight. When he did step on stage, for charity events, award ceremonies, or brief television specials, the audience no longer saw a judge. They saw a mentor, a man who had walked through fire and come back with stories worth listening to. His speeches were simple but powerful. "I used to believe success was about being seen," he told a room full of young creators in Los Angeles. "Now I know it's about seeing others." The room fell silent, every face reflecting the gravity of what he had lived through. Behind the calm exterior, however, Simon remained driven, not by ambition, but by responsibility. His charitable foundations expanded across continents, funding schools, hospitals, and music programs. He reviewed each proposal personally, often calling recipients himself to congratulate them. "You never know what that kind of encouragement can do," he said. "I didn't hear enough of it growing up." His voice, once sharp and commanding, had softened into something deeply human. Those who worked with him described a man who listened more than he spoke, who thanked every assistant, who remembered every name. The tyrant of television had evolved into the teacher of compassion. Health continued to challenge him. His vision worsened slightly, forcing him to rely on glasses full-time. Long flights became painful, and his doctors warned him against overexertion. "You're not 25 anymore," they teased. Simon would laugh, but quietly acknowledge the truth. The physical limits didn't frustrate him. They reminded him of how much he had endured. "You only start valuing life when you realize it's fragile," he once told a reporter, and I've learned that lesson more than once. At home, he found joy in the smallest rituals. Evening walks with Eric and the dogs, old vinyl records spinning softly in the background, rewatching black and white comedies he had loved as a boy. Friends who visited noticed how rarely he spoke about the future. "He stopped trying to predict life," one said. "He just lives it." Still, there were moments of reflection, flashes of the old Simon, ambitious, exacting, unstoppable. He worked on a memoir, though he called it more of a confession. In its pages, he wrote not about fame, but about vulnerability, failure, and forgiveness. Early excerpts shocked readers for their honesty. "I thought power would protect me," one line read. It didn't. It just made my mistakes louder. When the book was released that fall, critics hailed it as his most revealing work, a redemption story not of success but of surrender. As the year drew to a close, Simon sat with his son on the beach, watching the sunset burn gold across the horizon. Eric asked if he missed being on television every week. Simon chuckled. "Not really," he said. "I used to think I loved the lights, but it turns out I just wanted to be seen. And now I'm seen by the only person who really matters." The boy smiled, resting his head on his father's shoulder as the tide crept closer. That image, Simon Cowell, the world's most infamous judge, sitting quietly with his son while the sun dipped into the sea, captured the truth of his life better than any headline ever could. He had been feared, worshipped, mocked, and adored. He had lost and rebuilt, fallen and risen, broken and healed. And in the end, he discovered that the greatest legacy was not the shows, the ratings, or the fame, but the courage to evolve. When asked once more what he hoped people would remember, he gave the simplest answer of all. "That I cared," he said. "Eventually, I learned to care." And in that final honesty, Simon Cowell, once the harshest voice in entertainment, became its most unexpected symbol of grace. By early winter 2025, Simon Cowell seemed to exist between two worlds, the one he had built and the one he was slowly leaving behind. Fame still followed him, wealth still surrounded him, but neither defined him anymore. His life had become quieter, more deliberate, yet somehow more meaningful than ever before. The boy who once hid behind sarcasm had evolved into a man at peace with vulnerability, a man finally unafraid of being seen for who he really was. He now split his time between London and Malibu, maintaining a delicate balance between his past and present. In London, he spent days meeting with the boards of his charitable foundations, overseeing grants for hospitals and creative education. In Malibu, life unfolded in slow motion. Long walks, ocean air, laughter echoing from the garden where Eric raced their dogs. Friends noticed that Simon no longer talked about television ratings or deals. Instead, he spoke about music in its purest form, about art that touched the heart rather than the charts. "Maybe I had to lose everything," he told one close friend, "to finally understand what matters." The entertainment world continued to celebrate him, though he had stepped out of its center. In late 2025, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award, an honor he once might have mocked, but now accepted with quiet humility. On stage, he looked almost fragile, thinner, his once jet-black hair now silvering at the edges. When he began to speak, the hall fell silent. "I used to think success meant never failing," he said slowly. "But failure was the best thing that ever happened to me. It taught me to listen, to care, to be human." The crowd rose in applause, not for the mogul, but for the man who had survived his own legend. In interviews that followed, Simon began reflecting openly on his journey. He spoke of his parents with tenderness, admitting how deeply their absence still shaped him. "I think everything I've ever done," he said softly, "was just trying to make them proud." He confessed that losing his mother and father had left a silence no fame could ever fill. But through Eric, he found a way to rewrite that story, to give the love he never received, and in doing so, heal what had been broken decades ago. "When he tells me he loves me," Simon said, "I know I did something right." Physically, age had taken its toll. The pain in his back was now constant, though he hid it well. His doctors monitored him closely, warning that another accident could have lasting consequences. Yet he refused to retreat completely. He continued appearing occasionally on Got Talent, offering gentle mentorship to contestants who often burst into tears after hearing his approval. Gone were the sharp put-downs. In their place came wisdom. "You remind me why I fell in love with music," he would tell them. Those moments became some of the most shared clips on social media. Not for their drama, but for their sincerity. At home, Simon's routines were simple but sacred. Dinners with friends replaced industry galas. Books filled the spaces where awards once stood. Nights often ended with him sitting by the piano, fingers tracing melodies that never needed words. Sometimes Eric would join him, playing clumsy chords, both of them laughing when notes collided. "He's better than I was at his age," Simon would say proudly. To those who visited, that small, unguarded joy, a father and son making music together, was more powerful than any trophy. Financially, his empire thrived under careful management, but Simon rarely mentioned it. The man who once obsessed over control had finally learned to let go. His foundations continued to expand quietly, funding creative workshops and hospitals for children across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Each success story, a scholarship granted, a child treated, meant more to him than 1 million viewers. "I spent years judging voices," he once told a reporter. "Now I just want to help others find theirs." As 2025 drew to a close, Simon Cowell no longer seemed like the man who had once terrified contestants or dominated airwaves. He had become something far rarer, a symbol of endurance, compassion, and grace. The glare of fame had softened into the warmth of legacy. To millions, he remained the master of television, but to those who knew him, to his son, his friends, his quiet circle, he was simply Simon, a man who had fallen, risen, and finally learned that the truest form of greatness is not power, but peace. And so, as another year ended, Simon stood on the balcony of his Malibu home, the Pacific stretching endlessly before him. The waves rolled in steady rhythm, the same rhythm that had once carried him through chaos and pain. Beside him, Eric leaned against his arm, watching the horizon. "Do you ever miss it?" the boy asked softly. Simon smiled. "No," he said. "I'm living it, right here." And in that stillness, the world's most famous judge finally found his verdict. Life, with all its scars and grace, had been worth every note. As 2026 approached, Simon Cowell stood at a place few ever reach, a rare stillness after a lifetime of motion. The storms had passed, the noise had faded, and what remained was clarity. In his Malibu home, surrounded by sea air and laughter, he began to document his life not as a confession, but as a message. He called it The Sound of Silence, a personal chronicle of how fame can lift and destroy, heal and wound, often in the same breath. For the first time, he wrote not for audiences or critics, but for Eric. "So that one day," he said, "he'll know who I was before I became his dad." He revisited every memory, the failures that once crushed him, the scandals that nearly ended him, the faces that shaped his world. But instead of bitterness, there was gratitude. "Pain," he wrote, "isn't punishment, it's instruction." Every fall had taught him something vital: resilience, empathy, humility. He spoke of the artists who trusted him, the millions of dreamers his shows had touched, and the loneliness that came with power. He didn't hide the mistakes. He owned them, line by line. "If I hurt people chasing perfection," he admitted, "it's because I hadn't learned that love matters more than legacy." As the pages filled, Simon realized he was no longer writing about fame at all. He was writing about survival, the human kind. His life, once a performance, had turned into a meditation. Each word carried the weight of a man who had seen every shade of success and still found peace in imperfection. "For so long," he wrote in the book's final entry, "I wanted to be remembered. Now I just want to be understood." In the quiet twilight of his career, Simon Cowell's greatest creation was no longer a TV franchise or a pop sensation. It was the life he rebuilt from the wreckage. The boy who had once been invisible had become the man who finally saw others. His story had traveled beyond entertainment, taught in business schools, discussed in leadership seminars, cited as a blueprint for resilience. Yet when people asked him how he wanted history to see him, he always smiled and said, "As someone who tried, really tried, to be better." His foundations flourished worldwide, helping thousands of children find their voices through music, healthcare, and education. One evening, while attending a small concert organized by one of his scholarship recipients, Simon sat in the back of the room, unnoticed. When the young singer dedicated her song to the man who taught me to believe in myself, Simon's eyes glistened. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He simply smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you've given the world something lasting. At home that night, Eric found him at the piano, softly playing a melody the boy didn't recognize. "What's that song, Dad?" he asked. Simon looked up, his eyes tired but bright. "It's called Still Here," he said. "It's about surviving the noise." The boy laughed, and the two continued playing together until the room filled with a sound far more powerful than applause, the quiet harmony of love, forgiveness, and legacy. Simon Cowell's empire might one day fade from screens, but his influence, his courage to change, would echo for generations. He had turned pain into purpose, judgment into compassion, fame into faith in humanity. And as the waves whispered against the shore outside his window, the man who once ruled the world's stage finally ruled his own heart. Simon Cowell's name once echoed through every corner of the entertainment world, but as 2025 turned toward its end, the applause that had defined his life grew softer and somehow more meaningful. The man who once thrived on judgment now lived by compassion. He had built empires, discovered stars, and transformed television forever. Yet his most powerful creation was something the world could not measure: the quiet strength of a man who learned to love, forgive, and change. His charitable foundations were thriving, funding creative programs and children's hospitals across continents. Simon no longer sought credit for any of it. He preferred to sit at the back of classrooms and small concerts, watching young voices rise toward the future he had fought to protect. During one of those evenings, a teenage girl performed a song she had written about believing in herself. She ended by saying, "Thank you to the man who taught me that even the toughest voices can carry kindness." Simon didn't stand or wave. He simply smiled through tears. That moment, more than any television triumph, was the validation he had chased all his life. At home, his world revolved entirely around Eric. The two spent evenings at the piano, their laughter mingling with the ocean breeze. Sometimes Simon would hum quietly, creating unfinished melodies, soft reminders of a life that had once been full of noise and spotlight, but now existed in peaceful harmony. To Eric, he wasn't a legend. He was just Dad. And that, Simon often said, was the greatest title he'd ever earned. When journalists asked about legacy, he no longer spoke of shows or fame. "If people remember me at all," he said gently, "I hope it's not because I was powerful, but because I tried to become better." His life, once a relentless performance, had become a lesson that greatness isn't about perfection, but persistence, the courage to fall, to fail, and to begin again with grace. And now, dear viewer, as this story closes, take a moment to reflect on the man behind the myth. Simon Cowell's journey is not simply about fame, it's about the fragile, beating heart that lived beneath the glare of endless lights. He was broken, mocked, feared, celebrated, and finally redeemed. Through decades of triumph and pain, he became the rare kind of legend who dared to evolve. From the lonely child craving approval to the titan of television, and finally, to the humble father who values silence over applause. Simon has shown us all what survival truly means. His story is a mirror for anyone who has ever stumbled, for anyone who has ever believed they were not enough. It reminds us that strength is born not from perfection, but from persistence. That love, when finally learned, heals even the deepest wounds. And that redemption is never out of reach, no matter how loud the world's judgment might be. If this journey moved you, If you ever laughed, cried, or believed because of the dreams Simon helped ignite, then let this be your moment to give something back. Show your compassion, your respect, and your understanding for a man who gave his life to inspire others. Press like to honor his resilience. Share this story so more people can see beyond the fame and understand the human being behind it. And subscribe to our channel so that together we can continue to celebrate not just success, but the courage it takes to rise after every fall. Simon Cowell's life is no longer just a biography. It is a reminder that kindness outlasts fame, and that the truest power lies not in judging others, but in forgiving yourself. His legacy asks us one question: will we choose empathy over ego, compassion over criticism? If his story touched you, carry it forward. Keep believing, keep feeling, keep loving. Because just like Simon, we are all searching for that one simple truth, that even after all the pain, we are still here. Like, share, and subscribe to honor the resilience, humanity, and grace of Simon Cowell's unforgettable journey.